Politica. I'm the Deputy Director of the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes. We are one of the co-organizers of the present day conference, together with the Institute for Political Studies of Faculty of Arts of this Charles University and the publishing house Kořenům and Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. The main reason why we are here is that we are happy to welcome Professor Roger Griffin in Prague. I think most of you who has come in this nice day to this room, to this very hot room, which is bad, but I think everybody in the Faculty of Arts is used to that. Everybody knows who is Professor Roger Griffin. He's the professor of modern history and political theory on the Oxford University. His books about fascism are the reason we are here. On Czech you can read his one of the last books, Fascism and Modernism, and his lecture will be the very start of the conference. Afterwards we'll have a talk on the issue of the present day, of today's conference, which is an attempt to think about fascism in relationship to populism and the populist turn in the politics we have to face not only in our countries in Central Europe but also in the Western politics. And afterwards, after his lecture, Jakub Drábik, who is here, we are also happy that he came from Bratislava to us. Jakub Drábik studied history and political science here in Prague and even in Great Britain, where he met very closely Professor Griffin. And another participant of our debate is Jakub Rákosný. I think everybody knows him because he's directly from this faculty, a historian who also has written many texts on this issue. Thank you very much for coming, and I'm happy to give the floor to Professor Roger Griffin.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. It is a hot day, it's a beautiful city. I hope you have not had too much pivo at lunchtime because you will probably start hallucinating, but I hope to. So, this is not a normal lecture. I would not give this to my own students because you couldn't really set an exam on this, but I wanted to give you some, in English we say left field, which was a very great music dance record as well, coming from the left, but not from the political left, but from the idea of a slightly strange way of looking at things. So I start with something about your university. 1349, it's a bit older than Oxford, but it's pretty good, yeah? It was a multinational university, sectioned into parts called nations, Bohemians, Bavarian, Polish, Saxon. You use this Latin word natio, which I think is interesting, and it was full of foreigners, but it was built into the concept of the university that it was multicultural, multiracial. I don't think Islam was particularly represented, but it was definitely not based on a narrow idea of nationhood or belonging or identity. And so in the concept of university, there is also a sense of multi-faith, multicultural identity. It was also multidisciplinary initially. It followed the Paris concept of a university education initially, which meant that you started with the arts and then you chose your specialism. And I think that's a wonderful idea because the idea that you specialize immediately, I think is a very sad aspect of modern education. In fact, this bit is called, I'm not even going to try and pronounce your language, but spy hole. Google assures me, if anybody is familiar with Monty Python, there is a Hungarian phrasebook sketch where somebody goes into a shop and some evil person has mistranslated all the, so can I buy a stamp becomes something very obscene. So I don't know if I'm saying something bad there. One of the sad things about modern academic education is a centripetal tendency for people to spiral into more and more specialism. And that can produce a phenomenon called hyper-specialization or tunnel vision. Yeah? I started because I had no idea what I was doing on this planet. I started off because I couldn't do science. I did literature, which seemed easy because you just had to write essays. And the English are so bad at languages that in England, if you can do a verb, you're brilliant, even if you can't pronounce it. So I did very well. I went to Oxford and I studied French and German literature. And I then, having got a degree in Oxford, where I'd read all these different people with all these different mad ideas about the world, about love, about art, about style, that's what you get. If you study French and German literature intensely, you are used to looking at lots of different ways of seeing the world. And so that was my education at Oxford. They didn't really teach me very much at Oxford. Oxford teaches you how to bluff. If you don't know, you look as if you know, and you give a very empty answer, which means you can go into politics, business, and the media. And so if you look at British society, it is dominated by people who really don't know. And while I was at Oriel College, there was a famous historian called Lord Dacre, or Hugh Trevor Roper. He's the one who did not understand that these were not the diaries written by Goebbels. He made a big mistake. He said they were Goebbels' diaries, they weren't. And he said, I've just had a remarkable tutorial. I spent 45 minutes discussing a book with my student, and then we both realized that neither of us had read the book. So they made him a lord, okay? Now, I now, looking back from the age of 69, can see that there was a certain logic to my life, a deep inner spiritual restlessness, a sense of, now I have the language for it. I was looking for a sense of belonging, identity, roots, a worldview, eine Weltanschauung, une vision du monde, sounds more sexy in French. And why I was loving learning languages and literature was I was interested in how other people saw the world, and I was hoping that they would tell me something about myself, which is very narcissistic, yeah? And I can still say now that even though I teach and I write and I hope that somebody gets something from what I write, for me it's always a miracle if anybody gets anything from what I write. The driver of my research is to try and make as much sense of my life before I die without doing any harm and maybe doing a little bit of good. And I'm increasingly conscious of just how little I can see. Now, when I was an adolescent, I had a lot of, they're called crushes in English. That's where you fancy another girl and with hopeless situation, and you know that it's a disastrous situation, but you still fancy this girl. I learned to fancy books. I fell in love with authors, and one of the authors I fell in love with, and they can never drop you or send you a text and say, go away, was Kafka. And I thought it was quite appropriate coming here and going down Franz Kafka Street and Franz Kafka shop and cafe and laundrette and booking, you know, whatever, sex shop. But he wrote a lot of little aphorisms when he was trying to make sense of his life. And I like this, there's a peephole, by the way. Is that a peephole? Does that make sense? Yeah? Ein Guchtloch. Yeah? Life is as infinitely great and profound as the immensity of the stars above us. One can only look at it through the narrow peephole of one's own personal experience, but through it one perceives more than one can see. So above all, one must keep the peephole clean. We have a very limited time, and we're stuck in being Czech or English or whatever, male, female, and now, in my lifetime, we have other gender options. We can move into transgenders and whatever, and we can marry people from weird countries and learn funny languages, but ultimately we have a very limited perspective on life. But what we should keep doing is making sure that what we can see is clear. And so this is, if you like, a metaphor for my principle. Now, at each phase of my life, I was seeing different things. I moved into a history department. Crabs walk sideways, yeah? I walked sideways from literature into history. I have no qualifications in history whatsoever, except that I have an Oxford degree. So nobody asks questions if you have an Oxford degree. And I found myself in Oxford Polytechnic, which became Oxford Brookes University. Nobody knows who Brookes is, so they invented a person called Brookes, who was very, very important. But it's all rubbish. So Oxford Brookes University gave me the chance to teach. And because they wanted history of ideas, I taught isms, and then I taught... And we had a head of department who had fought in the Second World War in Italy, and he wanted to find out what he'd been fighting, because he was fighting fascism, but nobody could tell him what fascism was, except the Marxists, and they were wrong. So I spent a long time working on fascism, and then by 2005, and it's coming out in Italian as well, for what it's worth, but I mean, and there's your version. Is this wonderful translator here? Is she here, the translator? Oh, there you are. Hi. This woman I have tortured. How long was it? For over a year?
For over a year.
Yeah. She was 16 years old when she started. And that, I do not know how anybody translates this book into any other language. There are bits of it I do not understand myself. But by 2005, I was working on this problem of culture. Now, very, very briefly, this is like an instant guide to the Griffin theory of fascism. When I came into fascist studies, there were Marxist theories, and they knew what fascism was. And then there were lots and lots of different theories, and none of them made sense to me. And I was teaching a course to students, and they couldn't write proper essays because they couldn't find a definition. I had French, German, Italian, because my wife was Italian, and I could read Spanish and blah, blah, blah. And I love reading in foreign languages. It makes me less bored. I find English really very dry. So I started reading fascists. What was very strange about fascist studies was that ever since 1919, people trying to understand fascism had not actually really taken seriously what fascists said about fascism, which is mad, because people wrote books about Marx on the basis of what Marx said about Marxism. They wrote books about liberalism on the basis of J.S. Mill and Jefferson and the rights of man and all these theories. But when it came to fascist theory, they said, well, fascism doesn't have a theory. It doesn't have an ideology. It's sort of evil, or it's mad, or it's irrational, etc. When I read fascists, they didn't seem that mad. I mean, I didn't agree with them, but I was used to not agreeing with people because I'd studied literature. When you read a book, you don't say, oh, I don't agree with Shakespeare. I mean, you just read it. So I found that if you read using this principle of methodological empathy, you say, how does this person see the world? And if you asked a fascist how they saw the world, it was really quite clear. Yeah? In other words, I found in fascist writings a vision of the world, a Weltanschauung, a critique of existing society and an idea of where to go to, who was evil and to be destroyed, who was to be encouraged. I found it all, and I found that pattern of ideas everywhere I went. If I looked at the Falange in Spain, or all the places I could read. So I ended up saying, well, look, there's no objective definition of fascism, but there is an ideal type. An ideal type is great if you're a student because it means you can make it up and say, look, it's not true, But this is my ideal type. And then your lecturer cannot say, you are an idiot, you are wrong, because you haven't said it's true. You've just said, I think this may be useful. So I defined fascism on the basis of fascist writings. And I said, look, let's define fascism the way, what is the common denominator between Mosley and Hitler and Mussolini and Primo de Rivera, I couldn't get to Czech fascism because I couldn't read Czech. And at that time there was nothing in English about it. So it didn't. Anyway, it was behind the Iron Curtain. And the Iron Curtain wasn't just a physical curtain, it was very much a mental curtain. If you were living drüben, over there, yeah, that was just cut off. And what I found was that the key feature of the fascist mindset was that you believe your nation is a bit like a mafia male sees his sister when she's in trouble. Mafia Sicilian masculinity means you're really always worried about your female sister. We might talk about Muslim societies as well, but the fascist sees the nation like a woman in trouble, has to be protected from all these evil people, you know, Jews, homosexuals, capitalists, etc. She is being violated, vergewaltigt, and she needs to be saved, purified, put up to where she should. In other words, there's a myth of the rebirth of the nation, which I found in every single case of fascism. So I defined fascism. Easy. Nobody had ever defined fascism in a sentence. So there I was, living in my little house in Oxford and wandering around in a supermarket called Tesco's, and I thought, well, look, I'll put it in a sentence. And they'll either love it or hate it. Now, if anybody's had the privilege of being in my beautiful country, there is an evil thing you spread on bread called Marmite. Who here has ever tasted Marmite? Yeah, well, do not do what my Italian brother-in-law did, because he'd heard about Marmite. It's called Vegemite in Australia. And he got to my house and said, oh, Marmite, and he took this piece of bread and he put it on really, it's called an emetic, yeah? But this theory, you either love it or you hate it. And I have had many, many academics who think I'm a total idiot. But I think this is really neat. Here we go. Fascism, it's a political ideology. It's not a form of insanity. It is not a form of psychopathology. It is not a form of capitalism on steroids. It is an ideology. It's driven by a vision of an ideal world, a mythic core. Every ideology has a mythic vision of an ideal state, right? In its various permutations, because it can take many different forms, it is a form of ultranationalism. It's not liberal nationalism, it's not nice, cuddly, I can vote for it nationalism, it's not Theresa May liberal nationalism or Blair or Trump. It's a different sort of national. It is ultranationalism. It sees the nation like an organism, like your sister, and it's got to be made healthy. It can be sick and healthy and strong and die, and so you've got to make it relive using the power of the people. It's populist. What Hitler does in a big rally is he has this Volk, yeah? And if der Volkskörper muss aufgeweckt werden, and you've got to Deutschland erwache. You wake up. All fascists want to wake up. They think everybody's wandering around consuming coffees, bloody great big Starbucks coffees and bigger Starbucks, and they're running for a tram with a Starbucks, and they're dead. These people aren't Czech anymore, they're not German, they're not anything. They are what Nietzsche called die letzten Menschen. These are the last human beings. This is what happens when you spend too long on the iPhone. It has completely robbed you of your personality and playing stupid games, etc. Hitler, if you'd wanted to stop Hitler in 1929, you would have dropped 34 million iPhones and given them a circuit, and then they would have been taking selfies with Hitler. So that was my doctorate. I wrote a doctorate. The internal examiner didn't understand it, the external examiner did, and the rest is history, as they say. The book sold about 10 copies in 3 years, and then it went into paperback and it's still in print. And now it is used to torment students in many countries of the world, like South Korea. I don't think it's used in North Korea. By 1995, I was invited to write a book about fascism and culture, and I thought, yeah, I can do that. And it took me 10 years to work out what I thought about fascism and culture, because it's really complicated. Culture is complicated, fascism is complicated, each fascism is different, each national culture is different. And I realized that at the heart of the problem was that I had to sort out the relationship of fascism to modernism, because floating around in all this was the paradox that Italy, in fascist Italy, welcomed modernism, futurism, modernist buildings, or modernist graphics, and loads of wonderful stuff. And in Nazi Germany, they had exhibitions of degenerate art, a lot of which was modernist, and so there was a contradiction here. How could both be fascist? What was the relationship with modernism? So, basically, what I was forced to do was to try to go back to basics to understand why fascism in the interwar period in different countries was having different sorts of culture as part of the rebirth. And in order to do that, I did what I really did like Oxford for. I didn't stay within the discipline. I didn't see it as a political question or even a historical question. I did a little bit of do-it-yourself anthropology. And the premise behind, this is called existential anthropology, okay? Your premise is, and this comes from a poet called T.S. Eliot, human beings cannot stand too much reality. Too much reality, it drives you mad, it blows your mind, it makes you anguished, you self-harm, you fall in love with somebody totally inappropriate, you start gambling at night, you start buying things from Amazon you don't need, you know, all that stuff. Now, there's this wonderful guy called Peter Berger who created this theory of the sacred canopy. And I'm not even going to try and, except baldachin I know. And is that sacred? It doesn't look like sacred to me. Never mind. His brilliant book says that every culture is a sort of artificial sky. Because if any human being looks at the sky not through the lens of culture, it will, in American English, freak you out. The sheer infinity of time and space and the littleness of your life. So culture is created in order to give people a sense of meaning, being, transcendence, which you cannot get naturally. You have to do it through culture. I like Pascal, le silence des espaces infinis m'effraie. You know, and that's the 17th century, and he didn't even know how big the cosmos was, let alone dark matter. It's getting more and more scary out there, okay? And if you want a sort of metaphor for this theory of culture, look at the ceilings of sacred buildings. Because in a way, you can see the ceiling of all sacred buildings as, in architectural and pictorial terms, the artificial sky, which turns terror, Furcht, into what the Germans called Ehrfurcht. Ehrfurcht means honor, honoring fear. The fear where you are frightened, but there is a sense of order and beauty. And so I think, isn't that freaky? I mean, isn't that amazing? That's just a church ceiling. But you haven't got the infinity of the cosmos, you've actually got heaven. Yeah? Without any mother-in-law. This is all angels, and this is sort of... look at the mosques. Aren't they amazing? Because you don't need figures to create a sense of awesomeness, okay? Familiar? No? Should be. It's up there, okay? So, if you look at human beings from this point of view, you could define human beings as homo mythopoeticus. It is in our nature to create myths. It's in our nature to create narratives, stories, pictures, rituals. And before modernity, There were thousands, millions of cultures which had come and gone like species of dinosaurs. You know, I mean, the Aztecs and Mayas and all that, Eskimo, everybody had a culture. They never found a group, they never got to an island somewhere where nobody believed in anything except consuming and capitalism and promotion and sex. I mean, there was always ritual, always. So it seems like we are hardwired in our brains to generate culture to give ourselves a sense of meaning and purpose. Now, what is fascinating for me is just like there are thousands of different languages, there are thousands of different cultural systems, all of which have their own grammar. And all of them kept the universe stable. I mean, the Aztecs were killing people to keep the sun going. It's a bad myth, it's a very bad myth. But if you were an Aztec, you had a really powerful sense of meaning and purpose. So what happens when culture is destroyed by the forces of modernity? Culture abhors a vacuum. That's a phrase we use in science. You say, nature abhors a vacuum. There's always something there. If you take away a culture, a new culture will emerge. There is a very powerful instinct in people to substitute a traditional culture with new culture, or even just bits of culture. You can see totalizing cultures as an attempt to defeat death. So Christianity, seen from an anthropological point of view, is all about overcoming the fear of death. I mean, you've actually got it in the poster there, the defeat of death. What a great idea, isn't it? But now, of course, we're trying to do it through medicine, which is not a very good idea, because we'll all end up looking like zombies, okay? But of course, Christianity is just one system. Another famous system is Buddhism, where they say you are going to die, but it doesn't matter, because you'll be part of a cosmic nothingness, which is wonderful. And we'll spend our time meditating and getting close to nature and dealing with our demons. It's like the whole of life is like Californian psychotherapy, but without the iPhone. So if you accept that idea of culture, and then you look at the impact of modernity, and here we are on safe ground. People like Zygmunt Bauman and all the great heroes of sociology like Durkheim or Max Weber, etc. There is something lethal, there's something killing about modernity. It kills myth, it rationalizes, it scientizes, it undermines sacrality. I mean, in Britain, I mean, Nietzsche said that God is dead in about 1880. In Britain, God has been dying for hundreds of years. Nobody in Britain believes in anything now. I mean, it's the most powerful source of religious belief in Britain now is Islam. There are some Christians try to keep it going, but we've been getting used to, we have game shows, we have Strictly Come Dancing, we have holidays in Ibiza where you get very drunk, we have lots of different subcultures. But what people like Zygmunt Bauman alert us to is just how dissatisfying this culture is, and how there is a tremendous link between modernity and the massive rise in all sorts of anxieties and symptoms of mental disease. Mental illness is rising and catastrophically in Britain among the under 30s. It's just, you know, it's extraordinary. And there is a link there, because people are losing their sense of place. And Bauman talks about liquid fear, liquid modernity, the liquefaction of the solidity that you get from culture. Yeah? In 1848, Marx wrote, "All that is solid melts into thin air." Now, either he was on a very good sort of Colombian grass, or he had actually had a very deep intuition about the nature of the capitalist production actually destroying culture and creating this sense of, and in that sense, communism was an attempt to refix people with a secular culture. So the liquefaction of reality poses a deep but largely invisible threat to the possibility of a stably meaningful human existence. It creates what's technically called a permanent liminoid situation. Liminoid is where you always, well, I don't need to say it, you actually are living at this moment in the town that produced the greatest student of liminoid experience that the world has ever seen, which is Franz Kafka. Here is I've got it in, I don't know if you want it in Czech, which must be mind-blowing to be able to read that, but I'm going to give it to you in English. Seen with the impaired vision of a purely earthly perspective, we are in the situation of some passengers whose train has had an accident in a long tunnel. Okay, we're on a train, British Rail, in a tunnel, bang, right? The accident takes place at a point where the light of the entrance can no longer be seen, and the light at the end of the tunnel is so faint that we have to keep looking for it and keep losing sight of it. And we're not even sure which is the entrance and which is the exit. That's liminoid, okay? But all around us, we can see, because of the confusion of our senses, or the extreme sensitivity of the senses, unearthly creatures, and a kaleidoscopic play of images, which, according to the mood and the degree of injury of the individual, is either entrancing or exhausting. I think that's incredible. In a liminoid modernity, people fluctuate between feeling absolutely amazing and thrilled to be alive, or irrational attacks of depression and confusion, and I don't know who I am, and what am I doing, and this is the modern situation. Now, of course, we can all look, I put on power dressing suit, bought in Italy because my wife's Italian, and I've got to look smart to give a lecture, and I can look all confident because I've written books and blah. But inside, I'm much more like the Gregor Samsa, the Beatle, from Die Verwandlung, the metamorphosis. In this situation, what shall I do, why should I do it, is not a question to ask. So, from this point of view, modernism is the attempt to put back meaning, put back fresh vision, put back a sense of beauty, of transcendence, of spirituality. And it can operate in two ways, either through art, and that's what people normally call modernism, modern art. But it can also happen through politics. And now we're getting on to, I know some people think, what the hell is he talking about? I came along to a lecture on populism and fascism, and he's talking about programmatic modernism. I invented the term, and nobody uses it, and I am a complete failure. But I still think it's a brilliant concept. When you have a regime based on a vision of total transformation of society and of human beings and of history itself, Bolshevism, Maoism, Pol Pot, or fascism, where you say the present situation is wrong, it's decadent, we've lost our purpose, we've lost our meaning. If you are fascist, you have meaning. If you're Nazi, you have meaning. You know what to die for. You know who you are. This is political modernism. And that is the premise of the book, which now exists in Czech. That fascism is to be seen as a form of political modernism. That does not mean that all its art was modernist in aesthetic terms, but that the drive behind it, that created motorways and rocket technology and extraordinary documentaries about the Olympics, and created a sense of speed and energy and heroism in everyday life. You get up a fascist, you clean your teeth a fascist, you make love fascist, oh my God. You breed a super race, you embrace your past as a Czech or a Spanish, and you strut around, and your women are all very female, and they're at home having babies and bringing them up as fascists, and you're out there working heroically or killing heroically. This is a total answer to the problems of modernity. Hence, when you look at Nazism or fascism, what do you see? Social engineering, using art, using organizations, using the media to create this new world. Now, of course, it's hell on earth. It can't work. It's an anthropological nonsense. And in the case of the Nazis, it meant destroying vast categories of human beings who didn't fit the new age. So I'm not apologizing for it or saying it's a good idea, but it did have an inner logic. And because I'm running out of my own time, we can skip that bit. Incidentally, if you want a symptom of this, how Nazism is a new total culture, isn't that ugly compared with a mosque? But can you see that this is the große Halle that Hitler fantasized about when he was in the bunker. This was going to it was going to be so big that clouds were going to form. Clouds. It could have 250,000 people worshipping him. But can you see this in anthropological terms? This is an attempt to create a new artificial sky. And look at, for example, anybody seen the People's Palace in Bucharest? I mean, it's horrific. But can you see the link between that and the ceilings of sacred buildings? This is a secular sacrality, a secular sacrality. So, how does this relate to populism? Well, since 1945, we may have got some sort of rather testosterone-driven capitalism going again, and we can all become consumers, and we can all do, take Ryanair and go all over the world. But the forces of culture side, of killing culture, are getting stronger and stronger and stronger. I think social media, for example, I think that 11-year-old children are sending pornographic photos of each other to their friends. I mean, this is insane, I mean, I don't think Hitler would have liked Facebook. I'd like to see his Facebook page. Can you imagine Hitler on tweet? He'd have his own German form of Twitter, and he'd be twittering all over the bloody place. So, even though we've got material progress, the death of all those things that make us feel natural to be alive has actually got stronger. And what we've got all over the world are groups of people rebelling against globalization, modernity, the loss of a center. Yeah? So you get, for example, in India, hindutva, the BJP, you get a new form of Hinduism which says you can't be Indian if you're not Hindu. Can you see that's already there? And you're having attacks on Christians and Muslims because you can't be Muslim and Hindu. You can only, well, that's like the Nazis saying you can only be German if you're Aryan. You can't be. This is a populist reaction to the dilemma of being modern Indian, because the modernity is destroying that sense of belonging that once was. Look at Buddhism. Buddhism is meant to be a religion of. Look what's happening in Myanmar, where you've got Buddhist priests helping people persecute Muslims. That's insane. Buddhism is not meant. But once you say Buddhism for the Myanmar, you can't be Islamic and Myanmar because you're not. But this is populism, don't you see? It's a sick form, bad form of cultural identity. Christian fundamentalism in America is scary. I don't know if anybody's been to America, but there are literally millions of Americans. First of all, there are millions of Americans who believe they've been abducted by Martians. I mean, literally from spacecar. I mean, but you've also got millions of fundamentalist American Christians who don't believe in evolution. They don't believe in I mean, really, this is like quite seriously crazy stuff, but it makes sense. It's a sort of Christian American pioneer populism, if you like, that rejects the world, and part of that fed into Trumpism, of course. Now, therefore, in that context, the fact that millions and millions of disoriented Muslims who feel threatened by the Western world and feel that their religion is being destroyed by satellite dishes and modernity, there's been a very strong tendency within both Islamic communities in the Islam world and especially in diaspora Islam. The Muslims living in Denmark and Norway and Britain, second, third generation, they quite commonly say, what am I? Am I British? I don't want to be British. And then they discover their identity in being Muslim, and that can lead to radicalism. And again, can you see that it's this reassertion of your identity culturally is a reaction to modernity, which is making everything liquid. You can come out of your house and say, I am a Muslim, and that is what I am, and I'm not British, and whatever. And I think a very similar thing applies to modern Russia. I mean, Russia, having suffered under that disastrous Soviet parody of Marxism, then collapses into the worst form of capitalism you could possibly have. Some people said that they thought they'd get Sweden and they got Brazil. And suddenly you've got millions of disoriented Russians who've been through one system which collapses, and they haven't got no stake in the modern globalized international cosmopolitan world. They can't go to London and buy a £10 million house. I mean, they're just stuck. And therefore, you get a populist version of Russianness. It's Eurasianism, it's called, and I could give you a whole lecture on that. But one of the reasons why Putin is very popular is he gives millions of ordinary Russians a sense of who they are and what they are. And it's a slightly paranoid sense that the world is against them, and they're being destroyed by this and that and the other, and the EU and NATO, etc. And you get a sort of Russian populism. And then we've got Trumpism, of course, which is classic. You know, I mean, all the stuff about America for the Americans and xenophobia and all this stuff, and you couldn't make it up. I mean, this is Monty Python on steroids. If you were a script writer saying, why don't we have a fantasy film about this guy who takes over America, and his daughter is called Ivanka, and she goes around on every opportunity advertising her jewelry. I mean, you say, but this is insane. Well, it's not insane, because there is a huge number of people who do not feel part of this globalized, consumer, travel around world, and who feel deeply threatened, both for rational and irrational reasons. And of course, if we look at dear old Europe, Europe's a total mess in terms of identity. I mean, how many people really believe in Europe as a sort of myth of identity? You know, I will die for Europe. No, I'm not going to die. Who would die for England, let alone Europe? All these flags and ceremonies and Schiller and songs and all that. Rubbish. You know, when it comes down to it, I mean, Manchester United are playing tomorrow night when I'm on the plane, and it's a real tragedy for me. I can relate to my local identity. I can't relate to this abstract identity. So if you can't relate to the European project and you are suffering from it, your economy is being destroyed, your traditional business and craftsmanship, etc. And you can create this paranoid mindset like you have in Greece, which is only slightly paranoid, that there is a sort of German hegemony, etc. And you end up with things like Golden Dawn and populist reactions against the EU, and then, of course, you have waves of migrants as well. It's really debatable how unrealistic populism is. There is a problem about Islam. In Britain, we have Islamic communities where things go on that are illegal in non-Islamic communities, where you would end up in jail. But they're tolerated, or they have been tolerated, because it's culture. And there is terrorism. We've had this horrific thing today, last night in Manchester. I mean, there is a link between Islam and Islamic terrorism. It's not a direct link, but it's no use saying it doesn't exist. So populism is partly a sort of fear reaction against globalization, but it's also got some real socio-economic, cultural identity questions which help it run. And in your case, and this is very patronizing because I know nothing about Eastern Europe, you were just drüben, you were just over there, but I think that a sensitive sociology must exist of how strange it is for people to move from 1989, 1990, one collapsing system, into this weird, very unattractive Western capitalist system, which has massive defects socially, culturally, distribution of wealth, and then you have the financial collapse of 2008, etc. And it's not surprising that all over Europe there are people who are dismissed as populists who basically do not feel part of this international cosmopolitan global project. So what you have all over the world, you know, Switzerland, Lithuania, etc., are groups of people of different parties and strengths who feel a sort of them and us, the people against the system. And the exception to that is Hungary, which has a populist government. In Hungary, the government itself is a populist government. It's brilliantly managed to stay part of the EU while threatening to close down the Central European University, with which I have very great ties, which is totally crazy. I mean, this is like a real attack on freedom of speech. You have a party like Jobbik. I mean, it's scary stuff going on in Europe. So, what I would say, therefore, is that fascism in the interwar period was a very radical reaction against the collapse of the liquefaction of liberal capitalist realities after the First World War, which took many forms. Bolshevism was another one of those. They're really extreme. They want a totalitarian regime. Populism is less radical. It doesn't say, I want a new France with get rid of the presidency, etc. Marine Le Pen has never said, I will become a Führer, but you try to do it within the democratic system. But the nostalgia for identity, for rootedness, for a sense of tradition, for a pride in being Czech, a pride in being Norwegian, a pride in being... I mean, the Breivik killings in Norway in 2011, he killed the Labour Party representatives who let in the migration. He didn't kill Muslims. He blamed Labour Party left-wing politics for accepting migrants who will destroy Norwegianness. It was a populist act of terrorism. It wasn't even fascist. It was populist. Some wonderful books, just for the record. I can send this PowerPoint to anybody who wants it. Bauman, of course. Wonderful new book, David Goodhart, The Road to Somewhere. He divides modern citizens in Europe into two types of people. One is an anywhere. I'm an anywhere. I got up in Oxford at 4 o'clock this morning. I'm loving being here. Tomorrow night I'll be back with my wife, my son and my dog in Oxford, and I will not be traumatized. I won't have to go and see a psychotherapist because I've changed reality. I love changing reality. I change it like clothes, yeah? I'm an anywhere. But millions of people are somewheres. They feel threatened by anywhereness. They feel that the ground under their feet is being washed away. They want to feel rooted. They want to have their identity back, yeah? So that's a great book. The Retreat of Western Liberalism is also a very interesting new book, and Blow the Argument. Now, if you're interested in the more extreme version, I don't know if you want to translate that into Czech. I probably would finish you. But it's shorter, and it doesn't have so many long words. There's a very interesting book that might be worth looking out for, The Age of Anger, which is very interesting on especially youthful Muslims and Pakistanis or Punjabis or whatever who really don't feel that they're part of this modern world, and it's called The Age of Anger. And there's a wonderful new book on the French alienated people. There's a new type of movement in France, le mouvement identitaire, people who are concerned with identity. And I will keep it short by not reading that out. But basically, he attributes a lot of the extremism in French society, whether from the Muslim area or from the white French area, to a deep disaffection, which is ultimately existential. The identical desire for a belief which would give meaning to existence, one which would make it possible to start all over again, to transcend the abyss of nihilism. He sees at the heart of modern society a sort of black hole like you have in galaxies, and that people are fighting not to fall into this black hole. And some people just get addicted to sex or scratch cards, and some go into politics. And I think probably scratch cards is a better option, really. And please see Fight Club. If you want a single film that... And look at this. I see in Fight Club the strongest and smartest men who have ever lived. I see all this potential, and I see it squandered, wasted. God damn it, an entire generation pumping gas, working in petrol stations. Isn't that true? Waiting tables, slaves with white collars. Advertising has us chasing cars and clothes, working jobs we hate so we can buy shit we don't need. We are the middle children of history, no purpose or place. We have no great war, no great depression. Our great war is a spiritual war. Our great depression is our lives. We've all been raised on television to believe one day we will be millionaires and movie gods and rock stars, but we won't. We're slowly learning that fact, and we're very, very pissed off. And if you read French, there's a version in English. Just Google sometimes, Génération Identitaire. Amazing little videos that tell you a lot. So what should we do about it? Well, who's this we? I mean, I'm part of this liberal elite, and I come all the way over here. I'm completely powerless. I think academics, intelligent sociologists said that the gap between the political elite, the commercial elite, and people in this room, I think, is a tragic split in society. If only we could inject some of the knowledge you've got in this university into the political elites, it would be amazing, but we can't. But I do think that, for example, on a very practical level, the reason why the British are now in this horrific Brexit process, and I sympathise with the Brexiteers, but it's still a catastrophe for my country for the next few years, is because Cameron was a typical anywhere. David Cameron, who got a Spanish wife and travels around doing conferences and being paid a lot of money and speaking with a plummy accent, he had no idea how unhappy millions of English people were with the world in which they're living. He was really genuinely surprised that so many people didn't feel European and didn't feel that the EU was a good thing. The people who voted against Brexit, for Brexit, were often people in areas which were getting lots of money from the EU. But people aren't driven by money. There are much more important things. So basically, I think liberal and political elites have to take seriously the concerns of the populace, of the somewheres, of the people who don't feel existentially committed, engaged with the modern world. What it means for the human sciences, of which I am part, well, I use my courses at Oxford Brookes to try and bridge the gap between their studies and how they are actually feeling about being alive. I use Bob Dylan and Joni Mitchell and a whole load of whoopy-loopy stuff from the 60s, because I'm basically an old hippie. And they still write good essays, and they get good marks, and external examiners come in and say, that's a really good essay. But what they don't know is that actually it's a spin-off from something very different. I think this is the time when we have to get back to the original purpose of the humanities, which was about making us more human. And we are no longer peripheral, because there is a battle going on between extremism, fanaticism, simplified, demonizing views of the world, and the complex, beautiful, subtle worlds of the humanities. So enlightened university-led education, I'll blow all that, you know what I'm saying. Right. So I would love in my lifetime, but I haven't got long now, to see a new sort of humanism emerging based on the idea that it's not the West that invented humanism. Every culture has humanism in it. You know, Chinese and Zen and also, so multipolar humanism made urgent and driven by ecology, by an awareness of the fragility of the planet we're living on. That would be great. There's the hippie. It seems really meaningful after a smoke, but it probably sounds nonsense to most of the politicians around. But here I leave you with 4 images of healthy, humanistic populisms, right? This is the reaction in Oslo to the Breivik attacks. Did they go around lynching Muslims? No. They laid flowers for the victims. This is the protests in America against Trump's Muslim ban. I think that's great. And recently in Budapest, there have been protests against closing CEU. It takes a lot to get people out into the streets. I think that's fantastic. Would you do that if they were going to close down Charles University? I hope you would. And I like the fact that they use English as a universal joke language. It's so bad, even introverts are here. So I finished with Havel, who I was a fan of Havel, and I've probably gone way over time, haven't I? Last. Can I just read this? Yeah, sure. With your permission. I have these heroes. I think everybody has a pantheon of, I've got Bob Dylan then, before the Nobel Prize, I've got all these various people. Havel was one of them. And he gave this lecture while there was still a Czechoslovakia, about 2 years after the liberation. And it's on home, and it was in the New York Times. The category of home belongs to what modern philosophers call the natural world. For everyone, home is a basic existential experience, What a person perceives as his home can be compared to a set of concentric circles with his eye at the center. My home is the room I live in for a time, the room I've grown accustomed to, and which, in a manner of speaking, I've covered with my own invisible lining. I recall, for instance, that even my prison cell was, in a sense, my home, and I felt very put out whenever I was suddenly required to move to another. The new cell may have been exactly the same as the old one, perhaps even better, but I always experienced it as alien and unfriendly. I felt uprooted and surrounded by strangeness, and it would take me some time to get used to it, to stop missing the previous cell, to make myself at home. My home is the house I live in, the village or town where I was born or where I spend most of my time. My home is my family, the world of my friends, the social and intellectual milieu in which I live, my profession, my company, my workplace. My home, obviously, is also the country I live in, the language I speak, and the intellectual and spiritual climate of my country expressed in the language spoken there, the Czech language, the Czech way of perceiving the world, Czech historical experience, the Czech modes of courage and cowardice, Czech humor. Yeah? All of these are inseparable from that circle of my home. My home is therefore my Czechness, my nationality, and I see no reason at all why I should not embrace it, since it is as essential a part of me as, for instance, my masculinity, another aspect of my home. My home is of course, not only my Czechness, it is also my Czechoslovakness, which means my citizenship. Ultimately, my home is Europe, and my Europeanness, and finally, it is this planet and this civilization, and understandably, the whole world. Isn't that bloody brilliant? Yeah? And can you see that sense of concentric circles of belonging as an antidote to populism? La France pour les Français, Deutschland, den Deutschen, all this. Yeah, okay, I can understand your anger, but there is another way of embracing being alive, which means, yeah, you assert your roots, you assert your Czechness, you assert your Europeanness, but not by demonizing the other, but as far as you can, by embracing their otherness. So that wasn't much about populism, but in a nutshell, populism is not just driven by political or economic interests, which the EU is pretty obsessed with. There is an existential, anthropological dimension to politics, and if you don't see that, you will probably become a politician. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a fresh air from Oxford, I think. Thank you very much. Now, because the time is running, the word has Arabic.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure what I can actually add after what we've heard. One thing that I was missing a little bit in the presentation was like a definition of populism, what populism is. So, populism and fascism are two terms that are really elusive in the definitions. We don't really, there's no consensus among the academics. But I found the definition I brought here as one that is like really good one. And it defines the populism as a mode of political communication that proposes that the common people are exploited by the common or plain simple people are exploited by the privileged elite. And but the elite doesn't mean it's a political elite, but the, I don't know, intellectual business elite or people living in the capital. It doesn't have any, like, it's not left, right, doesn't matter if it's left or right or center. It's just the difference between the common or plain people and the corrupted elite. So I would maybe give word again to Professor.
Can I just quickly? Well, it was already very long, so I left out some slides. I was at a conference 2 weeks ago in Paris where we spent the whole 2 days. We spent 2 days on defining populism. So I'll write a book on this. No, I won't write a book on this. 2 points that I would make is one, when you go from popular to the people, if you reify, personify the people, das Volk, I don't know what you call it, Narod, no. Yeah. And it's very interesting to look at different cultures. Like Arabic has 3 different words. There's nation, people, and another word for people, and it's used in different contexts. So one of them is Ummah. So the League of Nations is Ummam, and it's Ummah that the ISIS is fighting for. So when you create the people as a singular entity, and you establish it as a sort of a true historical subject, and this historical subject is somehow being countered or repressed or destroyed by some other force. So there's a left-wing populism which sees the people, das Volk, il popolo, being destroyed by capitalism. There's a right wing that sees it being destroyed by migrants or whatever. You can have a centrist populism where the middle classes feel this or that. So populism is a politically neutral term, and it's always an act of the political and historical imagination. There is a major book by Benedict Anderson called The Imagined Community, and that's the way he defines nation. Well, the people as a sort of entity which is somehow true, it's morally correct, it has justice on its side, it has been repressed, and there is a sort of collective energy which comes up. If you take, for example, the suffragettes in Britain in the late 19th century through, I mean, the suffragette movement never became populist because there weren't enough of them, but the idea of reconstituting, reimagining women as an entire gender with political rights, that act of political imagination is at the heart of the construction of a people in that sense. So what is interesting when you get populism is you always have to ask, how is this people being constructed and who is the enemy? And then you get this idea of a Manichaean, it's called Manichaean, good versus bad. The thing is that when you're part of that populace, for example, Prague, I think, had a little student revolt in 1968, yeah? At that point, I was in Berlin in 1968, watching the German student movement, and at that point, the students, the world over, constituted themselves as a movement, which meant that when you went to university, you didn't go to do exams and get a job with IBM or something. You did it. You had a special role as a student to be the moral conscience of your people, and that there was a profound bond between being a student in Mexico and in Prague and in Paris and in London, because you were part of this movement. Same with the hippies. So populism can be both refer to categories of class, but also to groups of people within a society. It's a very interesting act of the political imagination, but it's always a myth. There is no people, you know. But the sense that there is a people is incredibly powerful. If you can do what Hitler did. I mean, Hitler came out with a wonderful thing. He said, in Mein Kampf, he says, you know, these communists, they have fantastic rallies. They have flags, and they march, and they sing, and everybody feels that they are part of this proletariat. He says, the function of a communist rally is to make the little worm feel he is part of a great dragon. The little worm becomes part of a great dragon. If you looked at the downfall of Mubarak in Egypt, that square, or if you look at Ukraine in Euromaidan Square, that moment, it must have been fantastic being there. Just this sense that you were no longer an individual, you're part of this. So it's a very powerful illusion, and it often ends badly, and it's not politically left or right. The big distinction that I'm afraid media is confusing is between right-wing populism and radical right-wing or fascist populism. There are groups in Europe that are fascist. They actually want to destroy the system. The mainstream populists like Le Pen are radical right to radical right. UKIP in England is just right. It's not radical, it's quite banal. It's anti-EU. It's never tried to demonize anybody. So it's very dangerous to create a demonized category called populism and say, these are the new evil people, whatever they say is fanatical and xenophobic and wrong, and we will carry on being, that's what Cameron tried to do. And in fact, we have to look carefully at what populists say and work out how dangerous they are, because maybe some of the things they're saying are actually quite true. Thank you.
I don't hear a microphone, so I've got another question. Roger, your lecture was very interesting, and you mentioned there very important concept, multipolar humanism, but it wasn't properly discussed. So what should I imagine under this concept? What do you mean with it? And the second question is following one. It is closely connected to the first one. You are often criticized that your genuine analysis doesn't reflect properly economic and social conditions of fascism as well as post-fascism. And I think in your presentation you mentioned many times economic globalization and its impact on our lives, but only briefly so. And you always mention the people here who are confronted with right-wing populism. But I think that the same problem is in the third world, on the other side of the barricade. Yeah, so your multipolar humanism is the concern with these people, or can you explain it more properly, please?
So I've been asked about this multipolar thing. Well, I spent a long time on this. This is a failed Griffin project. A few years ago, I had to go to a conference and I gave a paper on what I call transcultural humanism. The trouble is, it's not a very sexy term. You could never market it, transcultural. What are you on with transcultural humanism? If you were in a pub with somebody you wanted to interest and say, you know, what are you? I'm a transcultural humanist, that would end the conversation. But the concept is good. Because historically, the West seems to assume that humanism emerged first within Christianity, then with the Enlightenment, and then it's associated with liberalism, and then it's sort of diffused, it's spread through diffusion. And it's part of the imperialist idea, you know, that other nations that had cultures which were intrinsically fanatical and God-based, and we go around spreading this thing. But actually, if you are an expert in the history of religion or culture, you will find all over the world religious cultures which have a recognition of humanity and of a universal humanism and ideas of kindness and generosity outside your culture. And there are very major traditions of this. If you go to, for example, Taoism or Sufism or Sikhism, I mean, Sikhism has a terrorist side, but actually built into the Sikh myth of the universe is something about human beings. So it struck me that actually, if you ever wanted to save this planet, you would mobilize, like a benign Hitler, okay? You would mobilize, totale Mobilmachung. You would mobilize the humanism in each tradition. You wouldn't go to Muslims and say, you're all very fanatical about your Allah. Why can't you be like us and learn tolerance and liberalism, etc.? What you would do is say, your extremism is a betrayal of your own religion. You have in your religion and in your history, in Toledo, in the 8th, 9th century, there were Muslim humanists living with Jews and Christians and interacting with them across cultural divide. Not only that, but if you look at the history of dance, cooking, language, painting, there's always been cultural interactions. Cultures have always interacted. There's never been a pure culture. That is a myth of Japan and Nazi Germany. All cultures throughout history have interacted, have traded, have created hybrids, hybridization, innovation, making up religion. I mean, Islam, I'm sorry if I offend a Muslim here, but if you're not a Muslim, from a secular point of view, Islam was invented as a mixture of elements from Middle Eastern religions like Baha'i was, like Christianity was. There's no pure religion, yeah, unless you happen to believe in one, and then it stops, okay? So what I'm saying is that historically and theoretically, there is the basis for seeing the world not as a battle between like liberal Western values and fanaticism, but everywhere in the world, the ability of people to move mentally, emotionally outside their culture. Not only that, and I tell you this, I'm sure you know this yourself, wherever you go in the world, you could go to the slums of Dubai, and if you're in that slum, you will find humanity. I mean, the capacity of poor people to be human towards strangers is just astonishing. I mean, I was in Sri Lanka for a time, and we had the most amazing generosity from the poorest people, and there was we had no language or anything, and yet we communicated across. So I think that one of the big problems is that there is not a sort of global vision of humanism as a potential of human beings, which actually exists not outside naturally, and we have to mobilize it. It's already there. As for my neglect of economics and socio-economic determinism or pattern, absolutely, I plead totally guilty. I'm absolutely innumerate. I came to all this stuff from German philosophy, very bad way of getting into it. German idealism, Kant and stuff. I have deep respect for people who find economic drivers really important. In a way, what I'm doing all the time is I accept that unemployed, I accept the Rust Belt, I accept the fact that Lille will vote for Marine Le Pen, because if you actually live in Lille, it is crap. You know, there's a whole generation of people who've been let down by the deindustrialization of France, and that is the major driver for them voting for Le Pen. But what I'm also saying is that when you've understood those economic factors and you talk to them, they don't express themselves just in terms of economics. There is an existential thing going on. There is something about identity and belonging. And that's why they make the link between not just economic deprivation and voting for Le Pen, but the fact that Le Pen speaks the language of identity. She says, vous êtes les Français. You are French. Feel it. It's like an orgasm. You're going to be French again. Not I will give you jobs. Vous aurez les boulots. It's not that just les boulots. It's you're going to finally relax into your Frenchness. And if you look at the language of populism, you know, even dear old Switzerland has a populist party. I mean, I don't know what it feels like to be Swiss. I mean, I don't want to wake up one morning and feel Swiss, especially not German Swiss, because I'm so used to feeling British and I'd feel very, very uneasy. But if you are Swiss, it must be wonderful to feel Swiss. And it's all over the world. At the core of populism is not just socio-economic factors, but this ness, Czechness, that Havel talked about. But he talked about it, this ness must be compatible with your ness. You know, I had Jakub, he came to my university, I was honoured to have him there, and he's got a nus that I can't touch because it's in Czech, and I've got an English nus, and my wife is Italian, she's got a nus as well. But it doesn't stop us, well it can, when we have a row, and she always wins. But the point is, there's a way of acknowledging difference in a way that embraces otherness. Whereas populism, in its right-wing form, embraces identity at the expense of otherness and then demonizes, so that Islamists become terrorists. You get this collapsing from one category to another. And that is why populism has to be fought, not just as a socio-economic phenomenon, but as a sort of identity phenomenon. And again, the trouble is that most of the ruling elites and educational elites are happy with their identity. So how do they deal with somebody who's 13 and is dreaming of jihad? We had a 14-year-old boy living in Yorkshire who was doing well at school, and when he was upstairs in his room, he was radicalizing on YouTube, and he kept a diary, and this is a 14-year-old boy saying, I want to die as a martyr for jihad. Now what do? Do you give him to a therapist, or do you give him to an imam? Or do you just give him back to his mum and say, talk to this guy, there's something seriously wrong here. This guy was actively plotting a bomb plot. But I see driving that, not social economic deprivation, but a really deep identity crisis. You're absolutely right to stress economics. But really, there is so much more going on. And if you really want to guide to that, you just listen to rap. Rap is the most amazing art form of... You have, all over the world, you have millions of quite well-educated, middle-class kids pretending they're black, unhappy, and on drugs. And being really, really cool. Because it's therapy. How do you get through? I had Bob Dylan. Yeah, I went to Oxford and I listened to Bob Dylan to stay sane, okay? And if you want to get to the core of this existential side, have you seen Fight Club?
Yes.
You've watched Fight Club, please watch Fight Club. Take a friend with you. And it's like an emotional, you know, and listen to rap. And I'm saying, yeah, you're quite right, but I still think there should be more of this. And the point about this is it doesn't really come from sociology or politics or political theory. It comes from the world I left behind, which is literature and existentialism and 1960s existentialism, which was an amazing time. It went very, very wrong. But the realization in 1964 that your country was being run by people who wanted to drop nuclear bombs on Russia and destroy Vietnamese communists and lie to the public about that, and they wanted you to go and fight in their war, and that you wouldn't fight in their war, but that you would explore love and music and travel and hanging out, and I mean, it was just a beautiful dream. I mean, it was mad, but I think we need a bit more hippiedom in mainstream academics.
Well, do you think that the situation with all this is similar to the interwar years? Can we compare even those two? Okay.
I don't think anybody, I mean, I'm old, I don't think anybody here has lived through the interwar period. If you have, congratulations. The interwar period was of a catastrophic nature. Existentially, economically, socially, in terms of not knowing and not understanding the world anymore.
In our historiography, that was a golden age of our history.
Oh, well, no, of course, really? Yeah, because you created your nation out of the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian nation.
1920s.
Yeah, the 20s. Oh, we liked the 20s. We had jazz, we had cocaine, we had nations forming themselves, we had hope, we had jitterbugging. It was fantastic. We had technology taken. But the 30s, I mean, the 30s were of a socio-economic, political, and existential catastrophe, which we have no parallel to here. I mean, poverty there, we don't know we have no idea what poverty was. And therefore, your populism there, and it's in my definition, it's populist, palingenetic, ultranational. Now, none of these populist parties, well, a few little ones, want to destroy the capitalist system and replace it with a totalitarian regime. I mean, Geert Wilders, he doesn't want a new Holland. He's not Mussert. He just wants to Holland for the Dutch. That is not the same. So just as the crisis was much deeper, so the solutions were more radical. Now Bolshevism has discredited itself. Who can believe in Bolshevism anymore? Maoism has become a sort of totalitarian form of capitalism. Pol Pot, let's not even go there. All the gods have failed. So what do you do if you're young and you're looking for some extreme? There are no causes anymore. That's why I like Fight Club. So I think that it's, in a way, there's nowhere to go. I don't know where is there to go? I mean, if you could, except within your own little sphere. I see that statement in Fight Club where you say, there are no big causes anymore. What do young people live? In the 60s even, where there was so much going on, you could still fight the Cold War, or if you were the Baader-Meinhof-Gruppe, you could fight the German state, or if you were in Italy, you could be a Brigate Rosse terrorist and fight capitalism. I mean, you could still blow things up, but now the only people who can really blow things up are either one or two very rare neo-Nazis or a lot of very dangerous, disaffected young Muslims. But mainstream educated white Europeans, I think it's very sad. I don't know, my son wants to be a doctor, you know, and in a collapsing national health system. And he seems to live without any need for big ideas, which maybe is a mercy. But I was injected in my youth with the idea that there had to be something bigger. And that's what kept me driving through. Sorry, I am now what's called rambling, and I will give back the microphone.
Roger, when I listened to your previous answer, I invented one methodological question to you.
Oh, methodology. I'm frightened of methodology, okay?
About old-fashioned structural functionalism and its distinction between manifested and latent function. Your answer was based on manifested function. You answered, yeah, listen to rap, listen to people at the demonstration, supported Lapan. So, is it acceptable for you to use this distinction on manifest and latent function in contemporary science, or it is impossible in 21st century?
Well, the distinction you make between manifested and latent...
Latent.
What? Latent function?
Yeah, so...
Yeah. This is not part of my active vocabulary. Don't forget, I avoided any serious engagement with the human sciences. I have never, ever studied the human sciences. So that makes me open to criticism from various points of view. There are lots of things I just don't know. I have been accused of essentializing, reifying, and all sorts of things. I don't really, I mean, Descartes said, he who cannot think for himself gives himself a method. Okay? Students at my university are asked, when they plan an essay, they have to fill in a little box saying which theory they're going to use. I think that's insane. I mean, I've never thought about that. I believe in a thing called, this is my answer to you, I am a methodological pluralist. In other words, I make books like you make curry. I use a bit of this and a bit of that and a bit of spice. I'll use a bit of Nietzsche here and a bit of Adam and a bit of Max Weber here. And I cannot defend that. There is no rigor. I do not have a German gene, okay? I write books that make sense to me because I've read lots of books and they only make partial sense. So I tend to hybridize things and hope that it works. Now, I would find me very irritating if I was a rigorous political scientist or social scientist or economist or what. So what I've written is a sort of, how do I explain Nazi culture? Well, I have to go right back to basics and I sort of make it up. I cannot recommend that to people. If I did this for as a doctorate, I would fail. But I hope, well, I do have a new generation of people who use my theory of fascism, and I could never have arrived at my new theory of fascism. You know, that it's said, and I don't want to compare myself with Einstein, but it's been seriously said that Einstein would never have got a grant to write a doctorate on his theory of relativity. It would have come before the board, and they say, you can't do that. Because I do think sometimes, that's why I said it's left field, I think sometimes you just have to bring together the bits of your life that, with gut feelings. Have you got that expression in Czech? Ça vous prend au tripes in French. It takes you in the gut. You can have gut feelings about, this is a great and very well-researched book, but it's crap. This doesn't explain. There's something else. And if you follow that something else, you may end up moving between disciplines. And to cover yourself, you say, I am a methodological pluralist. Yeah? And fortunately for me, there are several major writers who I respect who do exactly the same thing. So I can say I'm in good company. But in a sense, if people are looking for, say, a definition of fascism or an explanation of modernism, and they read my stuff for a bit and say, I sent my book to a very major historian called Richard Evans, and he sent it back to me. He said I couldn't read more than 2 pages. And I thought, that's all right. Well, I was a bit hurt, but I mean, he's a real historian. And what I write isn't real history. I mean, it starts off my book with a quote from Sting, or was it Bob Dylan? And it basically says, don't take this book seriously. If you want a straight academic normal book, this is not for you. And it signals that very early on. So in a way, I think, in the Bible it says, my house has many mansions. It's a very strange translation. I think academics is so big that it can have one Griffin. I would not like to live in a world with lots of Griffins. Then it would be like Slim Shady and Eminem, you know, would the real Roger Griffin please stand up, please stand up. I don't want to create Griffin clones, but what I am happy about is this, that the students I teach who go on to do doctorates write really original doctorates, because they feel the intellectual freedom to go into themselves a bit. I mean, Karl Popper, who was a major methodological theorist of objective method, he says, look, there's no such thing as objectivity. Ultimately, we must write about things that interest us. The idea that objectivity means killing your passion, no, it's the opposite. It is controlling your passion through rigorous use of empirical method. Now, I think if you read my modernism book, there's a lot of empiricism there, but what drives it is a certain vision of modernism as a response to modernity, and I think there's something in that. And if somebody comes out with that and says, you know, that's quite interesting, at the same time that there was political modernism, that you had Kandinsky and you had theosophy and you had all these experiments with new ways of seeing the world, and they all offered a spiritual solution to the problem of being alive. And so maybe there is a subterranean, that's all if that goes across, I'm happy. And if a person who wants to go into academia, which is mad, by the way, it's a, you know, get yourself a life, but if you want to go into academics, and your partner is also an academic, that's even worse. At least have one person who's earning money, okay? But if you want to do it, I think you must bring something deep about yourself into this. And as I said at the beginning of my talk, ultimately, I'm just trying to keep that strange word, spy hole, what is it in Czech? There you are. I'm trying to keep that clean. And I'm trying to not look at it through the fake lies, the fake truths, the fake visions of other people, you know. I mean, to that extent, I'm just trying to create my own truth. William Blake, one of our good mystic poets, William Blake said, I must create my own system or be enslaved by another man's. And at least everything I've done, my legacy is nothing, but all those books are me. You couldn't download them from some idiot in California for $400. You couldn't give them the topic and download it and say, hand it in. This is all me. And all I can say is it's only worth being an academic if you try to make it all you. That means you must learn as much as you can, but ultimately it's your song. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
But I didn't answer your question, because I didn't really understand it. Okay.
Maybe as a space for a last question before break.
Thank you very much for your inspiring lecture, or rather life lesson, maybe. You started your lecture with reference to fascist writers you decided to read in order to understand the fascism. So my question is, and don't take me wrong, because it's about the political ideas, not political values, but who is your favorite fascist writer? If you have, like, anyone. And yes, that's it.
So you want to know my favorite?
Fascist writer.
Well, you can't really have a favorite fascist writer, but I tell you people who I think are very, very interesting. I mean, if you take somebody like Gottfried Benn. Gottfried Benn was a Nazi, a member of the Nazi Chamber of Literature. He was head of the Prussian State Literary Academy. Before he became a Nazi, he was a doctor who got obsessed with the pathology of the human body and wrote these really mind-bending expressionist poems about death and decay. Yeah? And there you can see this he ends up writing essays for the Nazi regime, longing for the emergence of a new genotype of human beings. We will undergo mutation to become a super race. And he does all this Nazi stuff, and then when he realizes that the war is going to go against the Germans, he denazifies himself, and after the war he gets the Nobel Prize for Literature as an expressionist who's anti-German. I think that's fantastic. We'll talk about survival. So I think that if you look at individual trajectories, I mean, in France, for example, Dreux-La Rochelle, Céline, you know, some of these French decadent writers. I'll tell you a really interesting guy, Émile Cioran, or Choran. He was a Romanian fascist who believed in the Romanian Iron Guard as the salvation of the Romanian people and the omul nou, the new man. When Romanian fascism is destroyed, he spends the rest of his life writing the most depressing analysis of the human condition in perfect French. And he becomes a nihilistic existentialist. And he is, if you're ever feeling depressed, just read some Émile Choran, because you think, I thought I was depressed, and at the end you feel quite happy, yeah, because it's so depressing. You think, come on, you know. So if you take Mircea Eliade was a major ideologue of Romanian fascism, and he ended up professor of comparative literature in Chicago University, writing brilliant hippie books about yoga. How do you do that? Well, there's a link, but I won't bore you with that. So I would say if you take individual fascists, even somebody like Mosley, if you think that fascists are stupid and Marxists are bright but wrong, then you'll get it wrong. Some fascists are absolutely, really, really deep, existentially driven intellectuals. I mean, I know it's silly, but Goebbels wrote quite a decent doctorate in literature. Somebody like, who have we got in England? But I mean, even Spengler's quite interesting, and he created his own form of fascism. So there are many. And in Italy, have a look at some architects. People like Adalberto Libera, who does the most amazing modernist architecture for the fascist regime. We have people like Marinetti, who writes this mad male chauvinist nonsense, but it's full of most extraordinary energy. And it inspires a form of painting called aeropittura, which I would love to have on the walls of a small boy's bedroom. This is wonderful riot of colour and energy being painted by fascists. And precisely what my book was meant to do is say, this is not a contradiction. You can be a creative, imaginative artist and see in fascism the salvation of the human race. And this is not a contradiction, any more than it's a contradiction to do that amazing Catholic ceiling in that Ignazio thing I showed you. But at the time when he did that ceiling, the conquistadores were destroying Latin America. We just need to have a sense of complexity, a sense of ambivalence, a sense of, you know, some people take out of Christianity the most extraordinary beauty and love and compassion, and others become women burners. In England, we were burning women for having sex with the devil, you know, in the name of God. What is this religion? So all I would say is you approach human beings as really, really complicated, ambivalent. You approach every political creed as having the potential to make people more creative and more idealistic and heroic, but it's nearly always at the expense of something else. But if you want a reading list, I'll send you one. Okay, shall we break that? Okay, well, you've been very, very patient, because it's 20 to 4, which is amazing. So, I feel when I give a lecture, you know when you're driving in the bus driver in a bus is always having a good time because he's driving, okay, or she. For the passengers in the bus, There's all sorts of things going on, you know, drinking, singing, sex, sleep, and I don't know if any of that has happened in this room, but it is much worse for you than it is for me, so I thank you for your patience and tolerance. And of course you've been listening to this terrible language called English, which is a real drag. Thank you very much.